We do, if you weren't on the December 15th session, we do have a recap of that session in particular on our YouTube channel. I'm going to put it in the chat. But basically how I would kind of frame this is kind of in early to mid-December, one of the things that we had started to do after kind of going through what our approach would be in terms of reviewing the CA core profiles was to start to actually get that walkthrough for myself on the 15th on, how do I access the guide? What are the guide sections? What are the specific pages that we're looking for feedback on? And so I'm not going to give the full overview and the full kind of recap of that, but you are encouraged, if you weren't part of that 15 session, to kind of look through that. We are going to touch on some of the more specifics today and reviewing particularly some of the logic that's been applied within the context of the core profiles interpreting the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework. But without further ado, I think we've got a number of folks that have joined. I'm going to give a little bit of a recap on kind of the approach that we've identified, and then we'll just jump right into talking about the obligation logic and starting our review of the first profile. Are there any questions before we jump in earnest? Okay. So in December, one of the things in trying to figure out as a community, as the CA baseline community, how do we conduct a community review of a public and open specification that's being put forward from a very kind of early iteration standpoint? And how do we develop a process in place for us to review the content and kind of tangibly get our hands on it and understand how the profiles interact with the Pan-Canadian Content Data Framework, but also how do we as a community provide feedback and what our processes for that is. We started to kind of develop this approach for utilizing our Friday sessions over the next 2 months to conduct this community review and to start collecting feedback via the Excel sheet, but doing so as a community. And we've made a few announcements now on the InfoCentral channels, primarily Fire implementers, but we want to make sure that we're reaching out to other folks that might be involved in some of the other channels and communities to make folks aware of the particular profiles that we're going to be reviewing at each one of our session agendas. And our focus that we discussed in kind of our last call, when we're conducting this review, we want to really look at it from kind of 3 lenses when we're providing feedback, because we are in this providing feedback as CA baseline community members, and CA baseline authors and utilizers. And so our kind of first level perspective is trying to look at the profiles and comparing them to CA baseline constraints, right? Identifying if there are places where there aren't the alignments that we expected or that there are problematic differences, and going through the process similar to what we did with our due diligence review when we reviewed our baseline profiles against other Canadian profiles that were actively being implemented in the fire registry today. The second kind of perspective that the group thought would be really helpful would be to actually just kind of also review it from the perspective of, is the modeling that's been highlighted in this round, is it relevant? Do the mappings between the definition in the framework for an attribute align to how we would have expected that to be interpreted in fire? Do some of the decisions that have been made in terms of the selection of a particular element or the choice to pursue an extension over an element, do they make sense? And what are some of the impacts to kind of our systems in choosing these and in pursuing these choices? And to really kind of focus on that element to fire element mapping and the logic for obligations, because in this round, as we kind of covered in some of our earlier framing sessions, really this is very early days for the content in the framework. And so the content that the profiles are based off won't have the terminology and cardinality that we know are going to be and are already kind of making their way into the framework, but that at the time the profiles were developed, they weren't in scope. So our focus being really focusing on kind of modeling decisions and philosophical logics. And then the third perspective being, just like we do with our due diligence reviews, if there are places where we say, okay, I'm an author of a provider registry spec, for instance, and I can see that the choice that's been made for this modeling may have an impact to my registry or my jurisdiction, having the ability to flag those in feedback like early is a huge reason why we wanted to ensure that this kind of 0.1 version of the CA core profiles made its way out there, because it's a way of folks who are used to just kind of seeing and interpreting decisions in the lens of FHIR to also get a chance to see what some of these impacts might be to their own environments that are also using FHIR. And a big part of this approach is just going to be, you know, trialing this process in that we are one of the first communities to try to do this review as a community, as opposed to like us going out as individuals and conducting the feedback on our own. So what we're trying to do is kind of follow a sequencing between now and the 9th, and hopes that we kind of feel good and we're making progress, and that we're making our way through the 4 profiles that have been identified in this early release, with the ability to, you know, request for an extension if we find that we need a little bit more time to submit that Excel sheet before that 15th deadline. So I've highlighted the kind of the sequencing. You can see that, you know, obviously we're kind of partway through already with some of the framing. I thought it might make sense, because we have this session and on the 12th, to maybe start with one of the more fundamental profiles in this set, meaning focusing on patient, not just because it's, you know, so core to having a very kind of person-centric view of the framework and the profiles, but also because it's one of the places that as a community we've had the most interaction with other implementation guides, and that's had some of the most revisions and reviews as part of the CA baseline profiles. But, you know, we anticipate there's going to be some learning curve. So the hope is to start the review of patient today, and then to go into the remainder of patient on the 12th and see if we can get through patient. If not, we've got a little bit of buffer in some of the later sessions to either bring up or to kind of come back to any of the finalization of feedback that folks want some time to chew on. So I'm going to pause here and ask if there are kind of questions on this process before I show kind of, I've got a couple more links to throw in the chat around how we'll actually, like what Excel sheet, where do we find it, and how do we find the guide. This is also a sneaky water break for folks who are just kind of dialing in. If not, and feel free to throw your questions in the chat as we go along, or just pipe in. But as we go through this review, I'm going to be pulling the Excel file from the release page that has all of the feedback instructions. For those of you that are also interested in providing individual feedback, this is going to be a helpful link for you if you want to know, you know, how do I submit, maybe on behalf of my organization or just my own kind of personal feedback on the profiles. Those details can be found on the link I just put in the chat. If you're following that link, you'll see that there is a kind of a release page that has the details around kind of, you know, what are the periods where the community has the content available to them, and when are kind of the submissions for feedback coming in. There is a ballot spreadsheet that's here. It's a hyperlink. I've already downloaded it and I've got it pulled up on my second screen. I'll show it to you folks here. But the goal is for kind of after we get in the swing of things, for us to be filling this out on the calls with information about the profile that we are particularly focusing on, and what the specific, you know, suggestion or typo or comment that we have is. And so that hyperlink within the release page for the ballot spreadsheet will auto start a download of this. I've named it for the CA baseline review and saved it on my computer just so we have a kind of standing copy. But the goal is to effectively go through particularly the profiles in the guide, but obviously, you know, particularly if you're reviewing this on your own, or if we find the need to from the baseline perspective, other pages are, you know, heavily encouraged to have feedback in the guide provided for them as well. So I'm going to put this to the side just for a little bit, because I think one of the things that we want to make sure that we've got some time to do is to go through one of the core logics that's present within the CA core implementation guide to date and how it applies to the profiles. And then we can kind of get, as we were starting to dig into patient, bring that spreadsheet back and start collecting some of the feedback around it. So the other link I'm going to put in the chat, I'm going to put 2 more. And I would encourage for you folks to kind of follow along in navigating to these pages as well. So there's 2 ways that you can get to the actual implementation guide. You can go to the Simplifier project, which would house, you know, the profiles themselves, as well as any of the versions of the guide, or you can use the draft ballot release specific version that I've supplied in the chat. So I'm just going to show you, if we go to the CA core project, that's this introduction. From this, you can see if you're a person that really just wants to see the profiles, you can navigate directly there. If you're a person who cares about the package, you can find it via this package and kind of homepage. This is just a table to help kind of increase the visibility of multiple guide versions. And if you want to go to the specific version that we'll be reviewing in this release, you just click the homepage link, which should have the exact same kind of versioning URL that is in the chat today. So in that December review, we talked a little bit about—
Sorry, I'm Sheridan, just a quick housekeeping. I know we're not normally posting the slides, but the chat is ephemeral. So with all the links that are in here, is it possible to post this particular slide there?
Yeah, I can post it. We have an own cloud that I will post it to
Just
following session.
Yeah, just so the links are handy.
Yep, and then those same links are also on this as well, and those are in the Info Central, but we'll make sure to post it, because it also, our approach I think is going to be really important for folks that are joining midstream for how we're going to conduct the review. So we'll put those out on the own cloud, and I'll see if I can get the link for download by the end of the session. Thanks for that reminder, Lorraine. Okay, so
it might be worthwhile to put these in like a slide in the opening slides for the next few sessions as well.
Yeah, like the these ones.
Yeah.
So like that was actually a good comment, because I was curious if it will be helpful to start with a little bit of framing and like just like some intro slides as we do each of these reviews. I know it might feel like old hat by the time we get to like practitioner role, but I know we'll get some folks that are just interested in some things and they'll show up for things like organization instead.
Yeah.
Okay, so can do, that's super helpful. I'm glad that having a little bit of intro helps get folks kind of up to speed. I will say that there are some really core pieces in the guide. I'm not going to belabor today, but they are in the kind of the YouTube recording before, particularly around scope. I'm going to highlight some really important key pieces that are going to help us understand why we're reviewing what we're reviewing, but I'm not going to kind of drill into the actual kind of textual description. So one of the most important things to know about the 0.1 draft ballot profiles is that they are based on a very, very, very early iteration of the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework. And that the intent was to allow for us to kind of profile in parallel and to have this kind of bi-directional feedback and review that's occurring, so that we are keeping our kind of various communities in sync with the choices that are being made across the various components that are part of the Pan-Canadian Data Content Framework. One of the, I should actually say, there's really 2 areas we think are going to be highly impactful to the FHIR profiles and the profiling decisions that are made up in the framework, because we know that there are things like, you know, the context model, the data models, the data sets, value sets, glossaries, standards. But in terms of like the actual attribute definitions and the expectations and the terminology and how you use certain attributes in a context of, you know, a particular domain, where we're really going to find those answers from a profile perspective is going to be in 2 places. One is going to be in the data standards, and the second is going to be in the logical data model. This release really, because it is so early, is focused on the attribute definitions that are part of the data standards. We're going to have a couple more iterations of this. We'll have more exposure to the logical data model, which is still kind of very early and emerging, and chances to kind of resync up with, you know, further details like the kind of blossoming terminology and cardinality expectations. But for the intent of kind of this release or this version, we're really focused on that primary healthcare data content standard and the data element definitions therein. And so that's one of the reasons why when we go to actually kind of look at the profiles in our kind of review over the next 2 months, we have to kind of take a stance that, well, we have to apply a logic towards how do we understand the expectations that are in the profiles when we're still kind of very early in understanding whether or not, you know, this is optional or this is an element that's maybe required under some conditions, or this is an element that's mandatory all the time. And so as part of that, there's a logic, and it's described in the guide, in specifically the profiling conventions approach, to how we'll interpret the elements that are part of the data standards in the framework, the strength that's been applied in those elements, and how that will translate to constraints like obligations in FHIR. Now, because it's very early, what we'd like to do is propose these kind of quote unquote mappings and see if this makes sense to the community once we kind of have a good understanding of, you know, what do these obligation codes mean for our implementers. But in this iteration, because we don't have cardinality and strengths, we're really kind of treating everything as kind of sitting under this optional logic, knowing that things will kind of be strengthened over time, but kind of making this assumption that like all we know to date is that they're present and therefore optional, and that some of these, especially through feedback, may progress upwards into like stronger and stronger strengths. The other piece I want to talk about on framing kind of obligations and their logic and use within the profiles is that one of the things that obligations allow for us in FHIR to do that must support flags in the past have been a little bit more challenging in managing, is that they allow us to separate, you know, certain kind of actor targets for a given expectation. And so throughout the profiles, we'll see both expectations on a FHIR server and a FHIR client. So a producer of resources, someone that's serving them up, as well as the consumer of those resources, a client, an application that is trying to query or receive them, do something with them. And it's important to have the separation because different kind of actors have different behaviors that we would anticipate that they would perform. And so with kind of the current state as it is, where we're kind of making the assumption that anything that's been identified as an element that has a definition is at least considered optional, we're narrowing in on kind of can send and no send as the obligations to apply for that combination. And I'm gonna look at the can send with you folks and the no error definitions, and then we'll take a look at like how that actually gets applied in patient before we kind of drill into our review. So the other thing that's actually important to note is that, you know, this is a very kind of new and emerging structure. The intent of the obligations in profiling is to be able to provide a much more sophisticated approach that supersedes must support. Now it's still evolving whether or not we'll have to apply a must support flag in combination with an obligation. But at least for right now, the intent is just to say, you know, claim any of the obligations that we can in the profiles, describe what their meaning is, and then assess whether or not that expectation is too strong or not strong enough. So we won't get into like the nitty gritty of like what combinations will going to be applied because we really don't have the answer to that yet. But our goal is to assess from a baseline perspective, hey, does this make sense? How closely does it align to kind of our own expectations? And are there places where, you know, maybe we've assessed this in the baseline before and felt like our expectations around must support were too strong. So like I said, in that kind of profiling conventions page, The two that we'll really focus on for optional elements are can send and no error. So I'm going to zoom in. Is this big enough for folks? Can you see can send with the definition?
Yes, yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. So what can send means is effectively when you see this has been applied to an element, there is an underlying expectation that that system has to demonstrate some capabilities, some demonstrable capability to populate that element particularly in a testing environment. So it's one of the loosest expectations that we can have for a resource producer, for a FHIR server. And it effectively just means that you have the ability as a producer to, if we were at a testing event, or if we were in a testing suite, show me that you can populate, for example, patient name, and like as an underlying capability, that if I gave you a test patient and I said their name is Sheridan Cook, that you would be able to somehow get that information into your system and produce a FHIR resource that says the patient's name is Sheridan Cook. It doesn't say anything about what you do with that data in production. There's no additional expectations in the CanSend about how you effectively populate it and what the conditions of population are. It's just around system behavior. And for that reason, it's one of the kind of go-to choices for a lot of authors that are exploring obligations, because it's basically like saying, well, you can't just say, well, I don't support this. You have to have some way of demonstrating for this element, you have some underlying capabilities to populate and share this information. Now, no error is kind of, I would say, it's not an exact parallel in the receiving or the consuming system, but it is similarly very, very loose in terms of its underlying expectations. It's one of the go-tos for folks who are exploring obligations, but they don't have sophisticated system behaviors that they're expecting to be applied quite yet. Oftentimes, these are really good codes for things like bases and things like cores, because you can build on top of them. And the expectation is that it creates some underlying capabilities in your electronic health record and app ecosystem that you have in play. So the definition for no error effectively just means that if you can you demonstrate that if you were to receive a value in this element that this has been applied to, that you won't reject this information or ignore it in order to then process the resource on your end. So if you were to query a resource and it had patient name, which had a no error associated with it, that you wouldn't have to strip patient name away in order to then consume and store it, or do what you may with that patient record in order to get it to be processed correctly. And so it's a very, very light expectation, but it says basically don't break. Like if you receive this information, the expectation is that you're not going to fatally error because of it, right? You can ignore other things that aren't tagged this way, but for the things that we do apply this tag to, there is this kind of underlying expectation that you're not ignoring it and you're not erroring from it. There is a kind of a secondary piece, and this is part of the definition that's still evolving, but there's some kind of underlying kind of allusions to the fact that this may be paired with things like data absent reason or no flavors, though there is a more specific obligation code that specifically applies to supplying a data absent reason that is in the logic, but that we're not going to touch on today because it's for things that are mandatory. So I'm going to pause there before we, is there any questions about can send or no errors and understanding what their definition means when we see them show up on a profile?
Hey, Sheridan, Dragana here. I have one question. This applies only to one single data element in a resource, right?
Correct.
What about if you have a rule in the Pan-Canadian Health Data Framework that says, if you don't send these two data elements, you must send the third data element? How would you represent that in resource?
So if the expectation is around like the population and not necessarily the capability to do something, that might be something that's more effectively dealt with as like an invariant. And there's a really good example of this in patient that we've put forward. So I might actually just pop to this and see if it's kind of what you're describing. So within patient and in the baseline profile and in the CA core profile, there's an invariant here, oops, that says patient name given and family or name text should be present. And it's a rule that has either a warning or an error associated with it that has to do with the population of information kind of in production expectations. Is your question around like the in production, or is it around kind of the capability piece?
What you're showing me, Sheridan, it's still on the one data element level. How about for some strange reason, if you don't have birth date, you must give me, I don't know what could be like, it must give me the address for some weird reason.
So invariants, so this is, yeah, it's only applied to patient.name, but
Yes.
invariants would be the same mechanism could be applied for this element is populated or this element is populated or this extension is populated. Doesn't have to all fall under the same nesting.
Okay, so you can cross-reference multiple data elements under one resource, right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay, that's what I was asking. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions around obligations or there's only a few examples of invariants that have come up so far, but in the framework, but we can drill into this a little bit more if folks are interested. So while you folks kind of ready some of your questions, I wanted to just show you, you might be looking at the patient profile and thinking, wow, okay, that doesn't look so hefty, right? There's no cardinalities applied. We know to expect that. There's no, bindings that we've applied, and there's no must supports. Now, one thing that I want to kind of harken back to is that we've applied obligations within the profiles themselves, independent of the must supports. And why we don't have rendering for the obligations today in Simplifier, because it is so new, what we've done is we've created a table so that if you're not looking at it in the JSON or the XML and you're not drilling into the actual kind of lines of codes, you can see everywhere that we've applied an obligation. And so for the purposes of folks that are like used to seeing must support, particularly the must support definitions for the CA baseline, I would read these obligations, particularly if can send and no error, just like must support flags. So anytime you see an obligation, expect that what we're effectively saying in kind of earlier versions of FHIR is there is a must support flag on text and identifier. And in some cases, a must support flag on a particular slice, right? A particular pattern that we're expecting folks to be able to demonstrate. In this case, it's a pattern on the slice for MRN. And so what that means is that it allows for us to do some modeling that is independent of some of the kind of underlying expectations for demonstration, but have a really nice and granular way of drilling into, well, you have to do identifier and you also have to show us at least the MRN. And so like one of the reasons for making sure we spent some time on that logic for can send and no error is because, I mean, effectively what we're saying is, even though these things are optional, we will have the underlying expectation that our systems in Canada can demonstrate that they can send this information. They can demonstrate that they can send an identifier that's an MRN. They can demonstrate that they can send things like a address that's specifically been typed to home. They can demonstrate that they can send a contact that has been typed to emergency and that has a pattern that is machine readable and machine validatable. And so I wanted to ensure that, like, we don't just glaze over when we see a profile that, doesn't have a lot of these additional kind of visual pointers, because there are some real core drivers and expectations that obligations allow us to do. And so, when we're looking through and doing this review, I want us to be able to do that kind of both the comparison of how does this align to what's in the CA baseline, and also like what are the implications of having some of these expectations at the demonstration level for some of these elements that are considered optional, but that don't have a further strength yet, and to provide feedback if we've missed the mark, if this is too high of a bar for something that is considered optional within the framework. So from an initial perspective, like how are folks feeling about like the interpretation of the kind of the optional strength into having an underlying can send and no error obligation? Are there ones that jump out as, well, that's interesting, like I wasn't expecting it on that particular piece, or perhaps that's something that I don't have in my guide today is maybe must support or an obligation applied to it that might make sense for us to kind of drill more into as part of our review.
Yeah, well, we had some discussions when we were talking about must support a couple of months ago, where there are people, I think there was a couple of projects that asserted that, particularly for optional elements, they didn't want to commit to being able to send, right? So it may be that not all of our optional elements are can send, or even no error.
Yeah, and one of them, I'll say one of the mechanisms that we tried to call out in a few places with, for instance, the National Unique Identifier, which is currently a placeholder, is that you'll see it's been modeled here, but it's kind of like a to be defined, it's a stretch goal, it's something that doesn't have that underlying like existence, so it doesn't have an underlying capability. And you'll note that like that's something that's modeled here that doesn't have an obligation tied to it. And there are a couple places like JHN where that comes up. But if there were things that show up as can send and no error, to your point, Lorraine, that we think, we've talked about this and this felt too strong, then it might make sense to try to group those as part of the feedback as things we might recommend for not having an obligation tied to them, having some differentiation in the framework to allow for us to make that different logical choice. Are there ones in particular that it might make sense for us to drill into patient for?
Sheridan, just a quick question.
Yep.
So for consent, if it's not valued, what would happen?
If there's
Is there-
not a value populated in production,
Yeah,
the obligation doesn't care about what gets sent in production. It would just care about whether or not you have the capability of doing it in a controlled environment with a test patient.
okay, so this is not about an instance, right?
Yeah, it's not about cardinality expectations for an instance.
Okay.
And so when we look at what I'll do is I'll actually pull up, because part of our review, one of the things that we want to do is to look at the comparison side by side for the CA baseline. And I know I've got it pulled up in one of these. Okay. So I apologize because I've got my smaller screen today. But that can send and no error is actually pretty similar to our must support definition in the CA baseline. In the CA baseline, we have a lot of writing around why we made that choice. But ultimately what we're saying is when we apply it, it means we have an expectation that you have a base capability to support these. We're not going to say exactly what the behaviors that you perform in production are, what the business rules and the regulation and how you use it. But we have a base expectation that you by default have capability to do something with this element. And so when we look at where that's been applied on the right-hand side in the CA baseline patient profile, there's only a few places where that actually comes up. And let me just get the comparison point for CA core. So the places where that comes up are name, which also has an invariant applied, and birth date. I think the rest of the things that have been identified in the differential are places where we've identified and socialized extensions, or we've put like some slicing and cardinality constraints upon. But in terms of like a base, this is pretty much what I would expect for a base, in that it has to be kind of that minimal, common, the lowest common denominator shared amongst kind of all of our existing implementations to date. There's always been reasons why we've had to kind of relax must support in the past in the base that have led for us to kind of having a lot more must support flags previously than we have. But, you know, one of the things that I think when we do our reviews that we should be looking for is there a place where, at least in the baseline, we've applied something that isn't then subsequently, at least can send or no error in the CA core. Now, I anticipate that there's not going to be a lot of times where that actually occurs, or if it has to occur, it's due to areas that we absolutely want to have discussions on. But the reason I say that is because the CA core applies this profiling structure of impose to specifically say the underlying expectations of the CA baseline are imposed on this underlying CA core profile. And it's looking at the 1.1.5 patient profile in this case. So this would be our package 1.1.5 for folks that are less familiar with that. And so when I look at this, and if I'm saying, well, can send is kind of close to the must support definition here, like name definitely on the list, birth date definitely on the list, and the core has a lot more additional expectations that are applied, right? Deceased date, address, specific types of addresses. Those are all things that we might translate to in this model being must support. Are there things that we would have, like, that we've had discussions with in the baseline that we had to kind of walk back of? This was something that we wanted to have must support, but we had the reasonings behind systems not having kind of this as a capability very frequently, that we should think about providing feedback from the baseline perspective into the CA core? Or do we like that this has been able to be a much stricter set of expectations than the baseline was able to do under its current modeling logic?
Well, I guess that sort of depends on the purpose for the CA core as opposed to the purpose for the baseline, right? Because it's supposed to be more, my understanding, if I'm not wrong, the CA core is supposed to be more use case specific. It was developed in the context of use cases where our baseline was supposed to be use case agnostic. So I would expect CA core to have more expectations than the baseline. Of course, there are places like name where we can provide a data absent reason and some other stuff. So it's, the mechanisms all interplay with each other.
Other thoughts? Does that make sense to folks as an approach? Some of the things that, like, I was hoping we might talk about a little bit today would be like text, resource.text. We've never come across it in the baseline, but it is something that maps to one of the elements in the framework. And so understanding what that means for the baseline and also for our own implementations, I think would be helpful in providing feedback on what we think about both the mapping and the choice to have an underlying expectation to it.
Now, when you say resource.text, do you mean the human narrative part of the resource itself?
Correct. Yeah.
Yes, or I was going to say the display value on, say, a codable concept, right? It's slightly different. So you're talking about the narrative, human readable part at the beginning of a resource. And early on in FHIR, the expectation was that all resources have them. But I think that's changed over the years.
Yeah, and
I see a lot of instances that don't have the human readable portion.
so at least for like patient, like what we looked at was, I think it was in domain resource. So like with the patient resource, I'm going to go to patient FHIR. right? You're not seeing .text as part of this structure definition. But if we drill into the domain resource, which is kind of like the parent that patient further specializes, text is, as that narrative that Lorraine was referencing, is part of the underlying definition that patient leverages, and which means it's a structure that we have the ability to take advantage of for this particular attribute. And the attribute, this is kind of one of the things that I thought would be helpful to kind of review and talk with folks and see if this mapping makes sense and what the impact of it is that the goal is to have underlying comments and textual descriptions about that person. And some resources, I think like Diagnostic Report and some of the other clinical resources, have an actual note element. Many resources don't, but they have the ability to convey a narrative that can be things like, it could be the generated narrative using the structured data, but it could also be additional details that you're providing and kind of manually providing for the purpose of understanding this resource. And so rather than jump to an extension for this mapping, we put forward patient.text as a potential option to support this underlying framework attribute of person notes. But ultimately, I mean, this is kind of cutting edge, right? A lot of us aren't supplying patient notes in this way today, or we might be using a different resource to do so if it's applicable. So that's a big part of why we want to bring it for feedback.
Well, there's also an annotation extension, but I would be really careful because I think the definition of resource.text is, well, it's supposed to be human readable. It's not supposed to add additional information that's not in the rest of the resource, to my understanding. Now, I may be wrong about that because I haven't looked at the definition for quite a long time. But
Yeah,
I
that would be my understanding as well. And if I'm a consumer, if I'm looking at the rest of the resource, I would feel comfortable ignoring the resource.text because it's just the same information in a different format.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want
It
to-
actually can contain additional information.
yeah,
There's three flags on that element. Yeah, generated extensions, additional or empty. So additional.
okay, yeah. I mean, you can have a resource with nothing but resource.text, I guess. So
Yeah. No, you probably also need status in
Oh,
most
yes, you're right.
resources.
yeah, most resources status is required. But with very little else other than the text itself. I don't think it's what most implementers are going to expect. And I think if we have things like notes and annotations, and the notes and annotations can be either structured or just strings. I think some of them can be marked down. I would be a preference of using explicit elements or extensions that were defined for that purpose. But
How do others feel about that? Like the use of an alternative mapping to an extension for like annotations as an approach when we see things like notes rather than the use of text with additional. I mean, I think we heard from someone had mentioned that they're more than likely already, if they're getting this text today, assuming that it's generated, not doing more with it. Or is that the kind of common experience for others? Like, is that something that we want to provide feedback on, that based on our own kind of experiences as implementers?
Our system use generated because there could be some data elements that we purposely need to redact. And so we have our service to collect all the data that we're sharing and then populate only information that we're sharing. And for sure, it's the same information that will be available in the discrete data. And then we have we use notes for anything additional.
So would that be, I'm just going to look up the extension registry real quick. That annotation. Maybe, is it the note extension?
Yeah, there's a note field. which is annotation type.
Okay. So this is actually, this is applied to annotation, but effectively that there is a alternate annotation that's would be more commonly being used in implementations for things like patient notes today that we should be considering. Let's see if I can find it. It looks like annotation type is just applied to once you have an annotation. Maybe
Right.
there's a linkage in annotation to a particular resource.
Annotations used in the following places.
Sorry, say that one more time.
Just scroll down a little more. Annotations used in the following places.
Looking for patient.
These are for notes that comment on a resource.
And so person, patient, practitioner, those
Mhm.
types of entities are not part of this list today.
Right. This would be like, yeah, on observation, a clinician, saying, adding a comment that they thought that this measurement might have been off, or, that, they have reviewed this and, it's fine, okay to release to the patient or something, whatever. It's a way to add a textual comment to an existing resource. But things like a patient itself, everything that is part of patient is expected to be in the encoded content or would be in another resource.
So when we look at this patient notes, person notes, is there a better way of getting at this than patient text that we would want to supply feedback for? Because ultimately this would be something that would trickle down likely for the baseline as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it in patient text. Either as an extension on patient, or more likely, is it an observation, a text observation? Is it a document reference pointing to the patient?
Yeah, particularly when we're talking about mapping from the Canadian data framework, where they do have person in the way that logical modelers expect person, not in the way that FHIR defines person. So when we're sort of pulling what's in patient and what's in person together, we need to probably look at both of those for patient.
So one,
Sharon,
go ahead.
sorry, I was just wondering, what you're showing, is that part of the one that's balloted? Because I'm not seeing that mapping in the from the link that was shared in the call for review.
Let's
Is
see.
that
If I put
different?
this- so this is the ballot version. I think that aligns to the version that we circulated.
Okay.
There's a kind of a CI build version, but it should also have this information.
Okay. So I was following it from the email that was sent, but let me try again.
So, and just to walk through that while Finney's just double checking. So important to note that effectively this is a mapping table. You can look at this the other way from the profiles as well, but the table, it provides the actual kind of distinct definition. And these are the attributes as they were on November 9th, right? So the goal is to try to get a version, profile it, get feedback, sync up with the newest version, provide feedback into that version of the framework, and do this again, but there's always going to be a little bit of a delay. So one of the other things that that I think is something to highlight and that would be helpful for the baseline to consider as a feedback item is that kind of in some of the kind of emerging definitions in the draft data content standard for things like what is a person's used name used, there's more of a shift towards that architecturally potentially being conveyed through something like a period. So like, what is the date where something is effective? What is the date where this name is effective, as opposed to typing? And so for that reason, kind of at that time when we received the data elements and then had our follow-up to say, okay, well, what does this mean with the ChiHi team and with the architectural team? Our understanding is that the goal is to be able to convey, you know, details around the use of a given name. So for the interpretation in the core profiles in this iteration, we've put forward the extension, which is it's an ISO internationally utilized extension effective period, to differentiate between a name that would be previous and typed using the previous or using the use element, and one that would be more more time relevant based on whatever the periods of time that are conveyed via this extension are. But looking for feedback on that, like that is obviously different than how I think many of our production systems may not even be capturing these differentiations between previous and current names. But it is something that, you know, we're looking for community feedback on around whether or not this makes sense as the right kind of mapping towards this concept, and a scalable approach to utilizing an extension like effective period where we see these types of concepts occurring multiple places.
Well, I know in the BC client registry, they do track that kind of stuff. In fact, they've got some additional extensions around data threes and et cetera as well. And there could be more than one current name depending upon the source and where you've received it from as well. Because people will use different names in different contexts.
And so
yeah,
from that perspective, effective is more powerful because you don't have to select like the same use code on distinct names, or no?
Well, I think we're using all of those mechanisms. So, well, some people may not be using periods on use codes and things. The effective times indicate whether that name is currently used, but you may have two slightly different names for the same person with overlapping effective periods because they're both effective at the same time.
Is that how others would expect that this kind of these concepts would play out?
It may not be really common, but it's certainly possible. And the data system, the database behind allows for it.
And that was a registry use case, right?
It's a registry use case.
So one of the things that I'd also ask and encourage feedback on is, are there places where there are expectations that are here that are potentially, you know, more registry oriented and would be more oriented towards a registry profile versus this is good and right to have as an expectation for really any underlying system, because it will allow for us to have a better idea of, you know, the context of use for certain elements across a, you know, delivery of care. And so, you know, when I know we've got about 5 minutes to go. The goal for today is to kind of highlight some of these areas, but come next Friday, what we'd really like to be able to start doing is actually capturing both some of the commentary. I'll go back and kind of capture the recording via the recording, what we've said to date, but then also if there are distinct changes that we'd recommend, like I think what we talked about earlier around additional text, to put those forward as areas for feedback and requests for change.
Sheridan, so what threw me was I was looking at the actual resource, and went to the mapping tab, and the two are not the same. Was that intentional?
Let me see, hold on. So if you go to the resource itself for patient, that may be that they are, the mappings is an auto-generated table, and it uses the ID of the mapping and the element that it's been applied to and any additional comments. So basically,
So if you look at that one, I don't see patient text on that, or person notes, something like that. So it
Let me
didn't go
see.
over.
Mm,
So they're
I
not
think
the
it's
same.
because yeah, I have to actually see if this may be we may have to call out in the JSON. I thought it was there. Let me see if patient.txt is there. It is. Oh, but there isn't a mapping. So that's a technical correction we'll have to submit. So that's the reason it shows up. I don't know why it's not showing up in the rendering, but it is the reason why the mapping isn't being populated here in the automatically generated mappings table. That being said, the mappings table that's present in each of the artifact pages is more detailed and should be construed as the source of truth, but I will put in the technical correction to make sure that we get that mapping updated to identify the patient notes element as the mapping on the JSON for this.
And there may be others as well. I don't know, but yeah.
Yep. So the other thing that I think that's kind of missing from this view is that you really can't get a sense of what the definition is. So where possible, we've kind of taken all the comments that are there and then also kind of manually created a table that provides the definition alongside it. So I think the next session, there's a couple that I'd like to drill into a little bit more. So we talked about name use today. We did some preliminary review around the places where the CA baseline patient profile shares effectively an expectation, both on name and I think the other one was on birthday. There are a couple things like the name and variant that I'd like to kind of go over, and then to collect specific feedback if we have them on the pronouns extension. There's a date of death obligation that I thought we might talk a little bit about. And then the home address and telecom slicing, I think is something that would merit spending a good deal of time and like providing that feedback from a community perspective on whether or not we're just pushing in the right direction, as well as some of the emergency contact coding expectations. But in terms of like the preliminary review, my hope is that folks have enough of like an understanding of how to navigate the guide, where we'd like to kind of drill in for specific feedback items. In terms of prep for our next session, I would really, really like to be able to kind of have on one side of the screen, we'll have our kind of our Excel file, and on the other side of the screen, we'll have the actual kind of definitions, and we'll just kind of go through some of the areas and just have folks call out specific areas that you want to drill into. So please take a look at the profiles before next session. And if there are like specific elements that weren't on that list that you want to make sure we get to, bring them up at the kind of top of the hour of our kind of second part of the review for patient next Friday. All right. I will stop sharing. I'll stop the recording. I'm going to host the recording on our YouTube channel. It usually takes about an hour to upload. And I will post the OwnCloud page for reviewing past decks in the chat as well for folks that are interested. We'll put the deck from today in that as well. All right. How are folks feeling? We've got like minus 1 minute, but like, are there things that you want to spend, ways that you want to tackle the review next time that are different than just kind of walking by just specific line by line items? No, you're loving it. You just, everyone's just digging in the profiles already. Well, if you do have ideas, please let us know. I mean, this is a trial and error process for all of us, but the goal is for us to just get comfortable with it and to identify things that need to change or that need further consideration in both the profiles and the framework. So hoping to hear from many of you next session. Hopefully with a better voice. All right. Thanks, folks.